So ever since I first was introduced to resin 3D printing, I wanted to print a full model kit. Now it has its limitations and it's not as easy as you might think, so I'm just going to start off simple. A couple months ago I was contacted by Oliver. He had made a full 3D model of an Ariel atom, and he had also scaled it down to 1/24th scale and printed it out, tested it a couple of times himself until he was happy, and then released the files online. He sent them to me, and I figured this would be the perfect first 3D kit that I would be printing, as it doesn't have any clear or glass parts that need to be made or printed, but simply just some pieces for the frame, the wheels, and all the other parts all around. So easy enough to start off with if you kind of know what you're doing 3D printing wise. So the files were downloaded. I uploaded them into Box, the slicer that I use for these Elegoo 3D printers. I angled the print slightly to have it at the best position for the printing, and then also added some supports. Now you can just use some automated supports by a press of the button. Just be sure to check over the entire file, as you can see here, and make sure that all the parts that need to be supported are actually supported. So just go over it, check it a couple of times, and add some more supports where they need to. Just to touch on the slicer here a little bit, I'm using Box. There is a free version which I am using, and there is also a pro version. You would need to buy that membership yearly. I think it's a bit too expensive, but the free version works perfectly fine. And there is also an alternative from Lychee that is also a free and a paid version. From that one, again, I just like to use the free version, as that works perfectly well too. So just use whichever one you want. No need to pay for any of these slicers necessarily. As far as settings and printers go, I'm using the new Elegoo Mars 3, and basically using the standard settings. I'm only adjusting the layer height to set it at a 0.01. That is a super fine layer height. Just using the rest of the settings as standard, and adjusting the exposure time per layer to 1.5 seconds, as that is more than enough for these mono screen printers to start properly printing. You simply then press slice and export the file. There is also a supposed time that this will take, but as you can see, that is completely off, and in this case it took about 5 hours longer. Well, no hurry. I knew this beforehand, so not a really big deal. I just turned it on, left it overnight, and when I came back the next morning, I was left with a perfectly printed frame. I could then move on to do the same procedure to all of the other parts. Just slice them, angle them, add the supports, move it into the printer, and once the print is half completed, gently remove it from the build plate or leave it on and start the cleaning procedure. The resin I used was water washable resin from Elegoo, but I am still deciding to wash it in isopropyl alcohol, as that does a little bit better of a job cleaning it. But as the name implies, you can also just use water to clean the resin off of the parts. As you can see right here, all of the parts have been printed out and have been cleaned up, so there should not be any resin left on these parts. There can still be a little bit here and there, but that should just easily wipe off or clean off with a little bit of water or isopropyl alcohol. After their alcohol bath, I set them aside to dry, so that there is no alcohol left on the parts, and again, no resin. And then I could start gently looking over all of the parts, checking if they are printed well or if they need to be reprinted. In this case, all of the parts printed pretty much fine. There were a couple of layer lines and layer shifts here and there, but nothing too bad. So overall, I'm really happy with how these parts came out first time round. So as you can see, there are not super many parts included in this kit, and that is a pretty good thing, as it is quite an overwhelming process and can take a lot of time to set up all the parts properly, and afterwards, of course, all of them need to be cleaned up, painted, and built up into a full kit. Now, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, this is a pretty simple kit to start off with, as you don't need to make any clear parts. Now you can, as you can see clearly here, print clear parts on these resin 3D printers, but I would only advise to do so for small parts like the lenses front and rear and smaller details all around. The main glass parts for front, side, and rear will need to be made out of a different material. Yes, you could print them, but they would be super thin, not really all that clear, and basically not as easily used. Now, they would need to be made out of a different material like a clear plastic, Lexan, plexiglass or something like that, some super thin stock material, cut them out and bend them to shape. Or if you have the material and experience, you could also print a buck or a shape that is the same size and shape of the window itself, and then actually vacuum form the parts over it. Now that's not something I'm really looking into yet, but maybe for a future project I could tackle it, but that does require a lot of time spent into some research and development, and for the moment I think this is a good base kit to start off with. So the parts have been printed and not yet cured. They are fully cleaned, so I can then remove all of the supports, or sprues better known if you're a model kit builder, but in 3D printing they are called supports, as they support the print on the print bed and keep the parts in place and support it like that. Now they can easily snap off, as you can see right here. They make a nice cracking sound and it is quite the job to do. I personally recommend doing this before curing the actual print, as that will harden the parts and make it a lot easier to snap and break pieces. As you can see right here, some of the pieces are still quite fragile, and if they are all completely cured, the supports will be made into one piece with the main part, so to speak, and therefore can break and snap damage or just ruin the entire part. So for me, I like to do it before curing. Now I've heard of others also putting the parts into some hot or warm water, and that supposedly helps the supports break off even easier. I haven't tried it yet, but I will certainly do that in the future. All of the supports have now been removed. I can move them into the actual UV curing chamber. That is the Elegoo Mercury machine. This comes with a washing station, as you saw earlier, and also a UV curing light box with a rotating bottom plate and also UV light from all sides. I set it at 5 minutes, as that is pretty much enough for all of these parts to properly cure, but you could also just turn them over and put them back in for another 5 minutes. But the longer you cure, the harder the actual parts will become, and also the more brittle they will become, so that is all up to you. But after 5 minutes it should roughly be enough in most cases. Now the part that I snapped earlier is simply just fixed with a little bit of super glue. All of the parts are right here and ready to start the cleaning procedure with some actual sandpaper. As far as cleanup goes, there are a couple of things you need to take into consideration. These parts are made out of resin, so be sure to be in a well-ventilated area, don't breathe in the dust, and keep it clean. Now some of the parts have some of these small dimples left over from where the actual supports were and ripped off. These can simply be sanded out with a 600 grit sandpaper. In this case I'd like to use some sanding sponges. It takes a couple of seconds for them to be removed, sometimes a little bit longer, but generally speaking they can quite easily be sanded off. And besides those small dimples from the supports, there might also be some layer lines or some weird things left over from the actual files, in this case in the thread pattern of the tire, and again those will easily sand off with the 600 grit in a matter of seconds. Now in this case I'm pretty sure that they are not actual layer lines, but they were something that is done in the slicing. I think anti-aliasing will help this out, but I'm not entirely sure what the problem is. Nonetheless, easily stand it out and you can move on to the next step and on to the next part most cases. On this main interior piece on the back side, there were also a couple of support pieces left still on there that I ripped off, but some pieces just stuck to the main part, so I simply use a hobby knife with a sharp blade and gently cut it off and sand it smooth. All of the other parts were also sanded down with the same 600 grit to give it a nice clean look, also remove any of the imperfections, and to give it a nice bite for the primer to stick to it. As far as primer goes, I like to use Tamiya Gray Liquid Surface Primer or just their gray primer from the spray cans, as that is suitable for either metal, plastic, and also resin. It works really well, covers super good, and leaves a nice smooth finish, so I applied a couple coats to all of the parts. I let the primer sit and dry for about 30 minutes to an hour and could then move on to the actual color application. For all the colors, or most of the colors, I will be using Splash. They sent out a bunch of their colors for me to test out, and I figured this would be a really cool project to use and test them for. The main body color I decided to go with was Cerulean Blue. This is a McLaren color that has been made famous by Shmee 150, and I kind of thought it suited the style of this car, and most of it will be covered up with black later on, so there won't be really all that many panels left in that color. Some of the other smaller details for on the interior, like the fire extinguisher, and also on the exterior side, like the springs, were painted with a red, in this case just Ferrari red, and also the main frame itself was painted with aluminum. I wanted to have a nice contrast between the wheels, tires, and also frame and exterior color, so I decided to go with a gunmetal for the wheels themselves. I painted them with a black first to get a nice dark base, and then the gunmetal on top of it to easily cover and also give a nice reflection on the gloss black that was underneath it. So far, I'm really happy with the way that these colors are spraying. They are pre-thinned and work straight away after pouring them into the airbrush, cover super quickly, and all of the metallic flake that I've seen and used so far in these paints is really nice and fine and seems to be well scaled to the 1/24th scale that these kits are. Most of the parts I will just leave in their bare painted color, but some of the parts like the cerulean blue pieces and the wheels will be covered with the gloss clear coat from Splash as well. It is a 3-to-1 mixture, meaning you would need to use, for example, 3 milliliters of clear and then 1 milliliter of hardener. Mix it together, shake it up, stir it around, pour it into the airbrush, and you're good to go. Now normally you would want to add a thinner to this as well with a lot of other brands, but in this case with the Splash you don't need to add any thinners as it flows right through the airbrush and doesn't require any more thinner. So the first coat was applied on the cerulean blue back piece and also on the nose cone as well. I set it to cure for about 5 minutes and then applied a second coat to make it even smoother and glossier. It applies really, really well, super easy to use, and also gives a super smooth finish. Now I set those parts aside to cure for a couple of days and could then start carefully masking off all of the parts that I wanted to remain in the blue and add the black plastic pieces to the side and also all around, just giving it a super nice finish and cleaned up look. Now I have yet to test these paints on plastic kits, but I have heard that they can be a bit hot, so you do need to be careful. Specifically with these resin and or metal bodies, you don't have to be as careful as with plastic, as it doesn't really have anything to ruin or any weird things to do like that. So I will be testing these paints further in the future on some plastic builds too, but for now I'm really happy with the way that they turned out and super easy to use. Last week I also received a care package from Dispay. They have a range of tools, also paints, glues, and other materials for around the workbench, and have a super high quality standard. They sent out a couple of their products for me to use, test, and try out on my builds, and one of the first things I got my hands on were some of their chrome paint markers. So I used that for a couple details on the wheels, also for some of the chrome reflective finishes in the lights, and all other stuff around the build too. For some more detailing on the interior side of things, I already painted the fire extinguisher in a nice red and still needed to add a couple of chrome details around it, and for that I'm just using some mirror foil from Hasegawa. Other parts all around were painted in their base color, as you can see right here, the springs and the engine, and simply just needed a little bit more detail to finish it off with secondary colors. On the main frame piece itself, you can already see that a couple of the parts were completely included, like the over fenders, the brakes, some of the suspension and drivetrain pieces, and also the transmission. But just to give them a little bit of a difference between the parts, I decided to coat the transmission in a bit of Tamiya Panelline accent color, just to give it a bit more shade, a bit more dirt, and not have it looking exactly the same as the main frame. Now, along with some of the tools they sent out, they also sent out their paint mixer. It is a magnetic mixer. You simply just insert one of the metal rods that is included in the package into the paint bottle and put it onto the machine itself, turn it on, and with the magnetic forces inside, it will start spinning and swirling the paint around, and is a lot easier than having to shake it up. So pretty much all of the additional detailing has now been completed and the paint has cured, so I can move on to the assembly. A couple things to keep in mind with these 3D printed kits: usually they don't come with any form of instructions, so you'll simply have to do with some common sense, trying and testing. Now first I inserted the main base plate for the interior that has the seats on it too, then added the shifter and could then start on the engine itself. Now the engine is mainly one big piece, and then of course the exhaust is a separate piece. Those two need to be glued together prior to installing them into the actual skeleton or frame of the exterior, otherwise you will not be able to fit the exhaust on. Now it is a bit of a push and pull. You might need to squeeze a little bit here and there more than you feel comfortable with, but in the end, after you've put it in, it will slide into place really easily. For gluing all of these parts together, since it is a resin kit now, I'm using some super glue as well. Normally I would just use my Bob Smith Industries Super Gold or Maxi Cure formulas, but in this case, since Display sent out a couple of their glues for me to test as well, I figured why not use them. They have a non-whitening and also a low whitening solution. They are super strong and also still a bit movable after you've installed the parts, so they don't stick in place instantly and have a little bit of wiggle room afterwards. Just a couple more parts to go and this one is finished. Again, if you are interested in any of the parts or tools that I used in this video itself, I will be leaving links down in the description, so feel free to check those out, along with the 3D files that I used for the actual kit. I will be leaving those links there too. The side mirror is on, and that almost completes the build. Now it is a resin printed kit, so it doesn't come with a standard sheet of decals, so I had to scramble from the parts box, stole some gauges from a Honda decal sheet, and also a nice license plate to put on, and that finishes off this build. Overall, it was a really quick build. Took about 2 to 3 days to completely finish. The printing itself took a little bit longer, about a week to have it all finished, a couple of overnighters for the printers, and that's about it. Now there are a couple of imperfections here and there on the underside, as I didn't really want to spend hours sanding the bottom of a kit which will never be seen again, and fixing some parts here and there. But overall you could decide to do that, of course, completely clean it up and have a super nice finish all round. Now for me, from the top side, it looks really good, and that is what I'm going for. So I'm really happy that I did tackle this project. It was, again, not really all that hard to do. It just required a bit of setup and knowledge on the printing side of things. And besides that, it's really easy to build it up. It doesn't have instructions, but with these this amount of parts, it should be quite easy to figure it all out. Now I could have spent an extra couple of days on the cleanup again, but for me this was good enough and a nice step into 3D printing a kit for the first time. And I'll probably tackle this again in the future if I find some 3D files or kits that are suitable for 3D printing itself, and actually challenge myself a little bit more, but just take it one step at a time.